I am Mark. I'm the kitchen manager here at the Lancaster Smokehouse.
Hi, I'm Tim Boris, chef and co-owner of the Lancaster Smokehouse.
Gentlemen, just get started here.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions about brisket specifically. Obviously, that's going to be the big one for us. So yeah, let's start off here with Lindsay from Facebook wants to know, what's the process of smoking brisket? No matter how hard I try, I can't get it to fall apart like yours.
It's a pretty loaded question. There's a lot to go through with that, because you can start obviously with just the wood and the meat, and whatever kind of smoker you have or whatever means you're using to smoke brisket, and kind of walk you through what we do. So we use a local hickory from friends of ours who started a hickory business basically based off of our patronage at Hogtails Barbecue. So we use whole split logs of hickory, and we use Ontario beef for all of our brisket. And then the general process in this part will pretty much be roughly the same for everybody, but you trim your brisket first thing. So trimming, you're getting rid of excess fat and you're kind of cutting it into a uniform shape. Then you use your rub, so that could be as simple as salt and pepper, or it could have as many ingredients as you'd like. And then pretty much from there, ideally you let the brisket come up to room temperature before you put it on the smoker, and then you start smoking. And that can take anywhere, depending on the size of the brisket and the temperature outside and your smoker and how much humidity, and there's a lot of varying factors. It could take anywhere from 6 hours to 14 hours. Ours typically take about 10 to 12 hours. Again, depends on kind of the weather and some other factors. And then the biggest thing is just letting it cook and letting it do its thing, and registering an internal temperature so that you get to that 200 degrees, 205 degrees kind of sweet spot. And then after that, you just really want to make sure that you let it rest before you slice into it. Slicing it properly is very crucial. And I mean, other than that, that's kind of the short form answer.
Cool. So we'll get a little bit more into brisket. Brian wants to know, what are your recommendations for smoking ribs to be tender and flavorful?
With ribs, a lot of different cuts of meat that are often smoked, there's a fair bit of cartilage and fat and kind of connective tissue in them. I think pretty much the basic of what you want to do with smoking ribs is create some sort of seasoning that you want, a barbecue rub. So you can throw whatever spices that you like, kind of play around with some recipes of your own and work out some different seasoning blends. So yeah, add that onto the ribs. You can let them sit overnight if you want, marinate them for a bit, and then once you have them on the smoker, just make sure you got kind of a slow, steady, constant temperature on there. Maybe aim for ribs, maybe aim for around between 220, 240 at the most kind of thing. And then just kind of let them do their thing. Put them meat side up, and then that way all the fat will kind of cook down into them. And then you just let them smoke on there for maybe, there's also a lot of different sizes of racks of ribs. Depending where you go or what cut of ribs you get, they have different parts of the pig on them still. We at the restaurant, we get a cut of ribs with the breastbone still attached to them, so they're kind of bigger and longer ribs as well. So those take a bit longer, but I'd say the normal rack of pork ribs that you get at the grocery store, you go home, you smoke it probably for 2-3 hours or so, I would say. And then if you're ever wondering if it's done or if it's going to be tender or fall off the bone or whatever you're kind of looking for, a good way to tell is kind of pick it up at kind of the halfway point of the ribs, and it should bend very easily. And then you should see the meat kind of start to flake apart on its own a bit. And that's kind of what you're looking for to know if a rack of ribs is done to kind of that liking. Yeah.
All I might add is sourcing and quality of the meat, obviously. So we're pretty proud here to just only, when it comes to pork products, we only support Ontario co-op farmers. We have the Pork Council come here every year for a lunch or dinner, and we talk to them about how much we appreciate their product quality. And if you travel the States, in my opinion, you get a lot of variance in how your pork, the flavor of the pork, because of the quality. And again, in my opinion, Ontario kind of blows a lot of American pork out of the water.
onto Instagram. We've got Paul wondering, what is your preferred temperature for your pit when doing brisket? So here's another brisket question for you.
Our meats that we cook overnight, which are the larger cuts, the pork shoulders and the briskets, we smoke at a little lower temperature, probably around 220. And then all of our other meats, we tend to smoke at around 230 or maybe a little bit more. So for us, we found out, and again, I think that's something that kind of varies on the weather a bit. Like if it's really cold outside, we might add a few degrees just so that the smoker is kind of able to constantly make up for that loss in temperature. But like ideally, if you have perfect control over your temperature, I would say you want to hit around 220.
Are there any reasons why you might go with a different temperature?
Yeah, so like I briefly touched on like the weather and humidity and all that kind of stuff definitely plays a factor. Like when we smoke in the winter here, we're usually smoking at a higher temperature than we are in the summer. Also because in the summer, it's really hard for the smoker to kind of lose any of the temperature. So it might creep up, but you don't want to get anywhere hotter than that because it'll keep that higher temperature. So in the summer, it's a bit of a lower temperature that we set it for. And other than that, I mean, like different temperatures for different products. Bacon, sausages tend to smoke at a lower temperature, even like sub 200, 180 degrees to 200. It's less about making it tender, more about imparting that smoke flavor and getting it thoroughly cooked without it being like super fall apart.
And I think with kind of smoking meats in general, the process can be a little bit forgiving in that because you're cooking it at a low temperature for a longer period of time, you can check on it more often and it has a less ability to overcook if you're keeping an eye on it kind of thing. But I think there can also be like if you smoke something too low of a temperature and it has to cook for a long time, it can have a tendency to get kind of dried out a bit. And if you smoke something at too high of a temperature, then a lot of the time it doesn't have a chance for those fats to kind of render down and stuff, and you'll end up getting like unappealing pieces of fat or connective tissue in there. So I think for like pieces of meat like a pork shoulder or ribs or anything like that, I think keeping around the range of 220-ish is good for getting it cooked properly and for getting the smoke flavor and for kind of breaking down those connective tissues and those kind of cuts of meats.
Great break. We got Steve. Is being that handsome a requirement in order to make amazing barbecue?
Hey, Steve.
Steve?
The answer is yes.
Jen has a question about the restaurant specifically. How do you know how much to smoke for a day? And the answer is they don't. It's a guess.
Yeah.
If you've ever been here on a Saturday night,
They'll let the server take this one, yeah.
it's like a constant struggle. We recently started selling like vacuum sealed frozen portions of pork and brisket that we sell at a couple different locations and sell at the restaurant here, and that's been a huge help with any meat that's left over from the night before. We can use for that. But other than that, it really is just trial and error, years of experience, looking up about what last week was like, what next week's going to be like.
And then also like thinking about holidays and stuff.
Yeah, for
if
sure.
You're coming off of a long weekend, you tend to be a bit slower, or if it's around Father's Day or something like that, we can probably be a lot busier on the weekend, stuff like that.
So again, like if you've ever been here, especially on a busy night, you know that we sell out of meats. It happens at barbecue restaurants. Like I know a lot of barbecue restaurants that are only open for lunch and close by 2 or 3 in the afternoon because they sell out. We really don't have the greatest idea sometimes, but we just kind of do our best, and that's why we always ask people to like respect the process and just be patient and understanding that we will run out of meats and that we don't necessarily apologize for that because we try our best. Ideally, we run out of meat at 8:59 p.m. a minute before we close or whatever. Sometimes it's a little earlier. And like I said, sometimes we do have leftovers, and thankfully we're allowed to kind of vac seal those, and they're a really great like take-home product.
Danielle wants to know, what does a beginner really need to start? There's so much information that I don't even know where to begin.
Just do a bit of research. First, like you know what you want to make and what you like and what you're trying to go for. And then just do a bit of research into people who do those things really well. So if you look up a lot of the barbecue places in the States that are known for, if you want to do ribs, that are known for their ribs or things like that, or restaurants in town, if you want to call us or anything like that, ask what we do with our ribs kind of thing. So just get a kind of a bit of background knowledge about what you're going to try to pursue. And then a lot of it, just like with anything kind of, is just practice, trial and error. Just playing around with it, tasting everything. If you're making a seasoning blend for it, make sure you taste it before you use it.
Well, I was gonna say my answer. It's kind of a boring, unsexy answer. I would say the first thing you need is a cookbook.
Yeah.
We love cookbooks. Just do your research, find a really good barbecue cookbook, and that'll walk you through kind of, what smoker to buy, where to get it, and then all the following steps. So my favorite one's called Franklin Barbecue by Aaron Franklin. He's kind of like the barbecue guru, and you can look him up on YouTube and stuff. He's really great. He's got a really popular restaurant in Austin, Texas. And he does a really good job in that book of kind of walking you through like every little detail. Starts with the wood, and then he moves on to the smoker, and it's an offset smoker or what kind of smoker it is. And he just kind of goes from there. So number one thing I would say is a book, so you can really do your research.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of being able to do barbecue and smoking well is knowing not just like what you're making, but like why you're doing the things you are, and why things go well with each other, why you use certain temperatures, why the meat does what it does at different temperatures. So if you do a little bit of background knowledge into all those kind of things and about why things happen the way they do, then I think that'll give you a really good base point to try to start experimenting and playing around with some stuff when you start to know how things work in that way.
I will say the easy answer, you can just get, like, if you have a little barbecue at home, you can do the little method. You can look this up. It's really simple. You get a little foil pouch, fill it with wood chips, put it on one side of the barbecue that's on, leave the other side off, put your meat on the off side, and then you're just changing out that bag throughout the whole time. To me, that's like the easiest. You've never done it before. You want to know if it's worth investing in a smoker or whatever. Try that method out. Maybe do a rack of ribs or something smaller. Don't I would do a brisket on my first attempt.
Even some chicken drums or something that won't take too long.
And then you can that's a really inexpensive way to get started.
What's the best meat to practice on?
I would say one of the most forgiving cuts of meat would be like a pork shoulder or a pork butt, I would say. It's a big piece of meat. It's best if you get a bone-in cut. They're not that expensive, and it can feed a lot of people, and you can go pretty far. And really, you can't overcook it, because kind of the point with pulled pork made out of a pulled pork shoulder or pork butt is to overcook it intentionally, and that's when you get it to fall apart and stuff like that. So I think that would be a good one to kind of start off with, because you'll get to see the process of start to finish of how it starts to break down and how long it takes, and that you can be checking the temperature throughout to see what temperatures you can pull it at and stuff like that. So it's not like if you buy a really expensive cut like a brisket or something and you put it on and then you overcook it or you dry it out or whatever, you don't got to worry about losing a bunch of money. You can literally get a little pork butt at the store for $12, throw it on the smoker, and then it's done when it's falling apart kind of thing. So I think that's a good kind of starting cut of meat to use.
Yeah, I'd say a butt or a picnic are probably the best.
Yeah,
are the best go-tos for your starter.
Yeah.
It's also kind of meats that don't take as long. Chicken or ribs, those are also good starting points. Just because you don't have to invest as much time, but I think in terms of like what's the most forgiving, it's probably pork.
Yeah.
What's the easiest meat to mess up?
Yeah, the easiest meat to mess up by quite a margin is brisket. It's kind of like the gold standard that you measure. Like a pitmaster barbecue tends to be the brisket because it's the most complicated, it's the trickiest. You got two muscles essentially, and they're completely different. One's very lean, one's very fatty. Takes a long time. There's like a lot of factors that can contribute to the difficulty of it, and it's not forgiving. Like if you overcook it, you're gonna know because it's gonna fall apart. And if you undercook it, it's gonna be tough and not enjoyable. So I think that's pretty widely recognized as brisket is kind of how you can measure someone's barbecue. And that's why I'd say it's probably the last one you'd want to work on.
Yeah.
I want to start with the shoulder.
It's also one of the most expensive too, right?
Yeah.
So if you do mess it up, you're out a bunch of money.
Yeah, and if you're ever gonna try it at home, you want to make sure that you get whole brisket because it's hard to find outside. It's hard to find at a butcher shop or a grocery store. They usually break it down into those two different muscles, the flat and the point. They smoke differently when you disconnect them, so you really want to make sure that you find a whole brisket that you're gonna like trim yourself.
Adam asks, how do you work through the stall on a brisket? Would love to see a video of how you trim a brisket.
Hey Adam, first part of your question, how do we get through the stall of a pork shoulder brisket, any kind of larger cut of barbecue. So first of all, just kind of explain what stall is, because it's kind of something that barbecue nerds like to geek out over. Other than that, I think your typical weekend warrior kind of home cook probably doesn't know too much about it. So basically the idea of the stall is, if you were to look at when you put a brisket on a smoker until the end of it being done, if you were to look at a graph that showed its cooking process, you would think that it would just that would be kind of a straight line relative to internal temperature and time on the smoker. So what the stall is actually is at about 160, 165 degrees, and usually we're talking about brisket when we're referring to the stall, but it also happens with pork shoulders. So basically what happens is when you hit that 160, 165 degrees, the cooking temperature or the cooking rate really slows down. And you're like keeping track of the internal temperature. You'll check it at 160 degrees. You'll check it sometime later and it looks like it's barely moved, maybe a degree or two, whereas previously in the cooking process, it had like been going up pretty steadily. So there's kind of a scientific answer to it that I am not smart enough to really give you. Comparison I've kind of been told is like the comparison of like a human when they overheat, they start to sweat and to cool themselves down. It's something kind of that same scientific process. That's about as much as I know. So then the question is like, what do you do to get past it? Because typically, depending on your smoker and depending on kind of your brisket and how fatty it is and other factors, you want to look for somewhere usually around 200, maybe 205 degrees is the kind of optimal temperature to pull the brisket off. So what can you do during that to get through that stall process? It's really about retaining as much moisture in the cooking environment as you can, so that it doesn't dry out. Because the idea is if you don't really, if you don't attend to the meat properly, the outside will really dry out by the time you're getting that kind of super tender, falling apart brisket or pork that you're looking for. So a couple different options you can do is just using like a solution, like you could do cider vinegar and Dr. Pepper or Coke or whatever, and using it to spritz the meat during that time, and that's when you're going really heavy on spritzing to make sure that the outside of it stays really moist. And then the other thing that's kind of more traditional is it's called the Texas crutch. When you take that meat, you wrap it up in either butcher paper or tin foil, and then you put it back on the smoker. So now it's essentially at that point done smoking. Now it's just about cooking it and getting it to the temperature that you want. And by having it wrapped up, it's kind of going to steam, and it's going to be a lot more of a moist environment so that the outside doesn't cook. We're lucky enough here that we used to do a lot more wrapping than we do these days. We don't have to do it very often because we have a rotisserie smoker that is a really, really humid environment that keeps everything really, really juicy. So our model of smoker is not one that has as much kind of inward and outward airflow, so that you have to worry about it really drying out and not making it through that process, the stall, without it kind of drying out. So sometimes, yeah, we'll need it to finish it, but most of the time, because it's humid enough inside the smoker, we don't really have to worry a whole lot about the stall. At that point, it's just about being patient and letting it get through it, and kind of not pulling it off too early because you're hungry or you're impatient.
Can you just explain a little bit how barbecue varies from region to region?
The part that I know, Tim would know more about it because he's traveled a lot down there and stuff, but as far as I know that different regions of the South kind of specialize in different meats and different cuts of meats and stuff like that, where like something like brisket is a lot bigger in Texas than it is anywhere else, kind of thing. Some places just do whole hogs and that's it, kind of thing. Some places do a little bit of everything and do different platters and stuff like we do. Tim would be able to talk about that a bit more.
I think you pretty much nailed it. Like when I think of Texas barbecue, I think of beef and black pepper. When I think of the Carolinas, I think of pork and whole hog, and then I think of kind of their two variations of barbecue sauce, which are the vinegar sauce, which is like vinegar and hot sauce, and then they have a mustard-based barbecue sauce. Memphis, you get more into that molassesy sweet barbecue sauce. That sauce probably plays more of a factor in Memphis barbecue too. And then, I mean, there's like Kentucky does a lot of mutton, for example. So there really is like, I would say those are probably like the Carolinas, Memphis, and Texas are probably what people like think of as the big barbecue giants that like everyone kind of bases their variation around. But the more you travel, you realize that it really is like people have really started taking inspiration from, they like this about this area, this about that area, which is definitely kind of what our style is. So we still definitely have like the sweet sauce. I'd say we are probably lesser on the black pepper, or more of like Carolina with the like they do different rubs. Where in Texas you see a lot of just salt and peppers. So yeah, there's kind of infinite changes, and it's constantly changing, but those are probably the major differences.
And I think for anybody too that's interested in like learning about kind of regional variants in barbecue, I think like obviously the States is known for kind of region by region but I think kind of worldwide, like every country has their own versions of barbecue too. Like Africa does it their whole own way, a lot of different ways throughout Africa, and then there's other places that use pits underground and stuff like that, and they use different materials all over the world. So like barbecue and smoking meats and stuff kind of exists everywhere in all sorts of different ways. And if anybody's interested in learning about different kinds, I think it's pretty important also to kind of check out different countries' versions of it, because a lot of them are equally delicious to the States or Canada.
Is there one specifically you would say we lean more towards, or are we just like a mishmash of all of them?
I'd say we're like a pretty good mishmash. I also think that our barbecue has our menu has a lot of influence from lesser known barbecue regions like Louisiana. A lot of our menu, like for example, like to serve cornbread with barbecue is not traditional. People think it is, but white bread is almost always served with barbecue at a traditional place. And then like the sweet sauce is definitely more of I would say like a Memphis-y style sweet sauce where we use molasses and it's quite sweet, and we serve the meat with that sauce. And a lot of that kind of was just trial and error here of what we found that people like. We served it without sauce, with sauce, more pepper, less pepper, more garlic, less garlic, more smoke, less smoke. And so I think that like over the years, ours has been pretty finely tuned to what we think is like the taste of Southern Ontario and Kitchener-Waterloo in particular. Whereas back in the day, I think our meats were probably a lot smokier, and we got a lot of feedback about that just being too overwhelming for people's preferences around here.
Kia wants to know. For her. What is the number one mistake amateurs make when taking on the art of barbecue?
The most common kind of technical mistake is probably just not being able to regulate temperature and control it through that cooking process as much as you can. Like, it's very important to have a steady, even temperature. Hopefully it doesn't fluctuate much more than 5, maybe 10 degrees at the most. So a lot of the times what will happen is, you might get a really high temperature at the start, then you get all this billowing of smoke, and then you kind of freak out, so you turn it down, or you take out some wood, or you turn off the heating element, and then it goes way down because you're scared you're going to burn it, and then you have to get it back up again. And then doing that a whole bunch of times throughout cooking a brisket, which could go for 6 to 12 hours. I'd say that's probably the easiest and most amateur technical mistake. And then second, I would say just not being confident in when the meat's ready and letting it kind of do its thing, which is a pretty common thing for all types of cooking.
Patience.
Patience. Yeah, exactly. So just, the rack of ribs, it's not ready until it's ready. Don't get too excited. Don't take it off the smoker just because you want to eat, or again, like you're impatient.
Start cutting into things and opening them up to see if they're done.
To check it.
Yeah.
And I always say, I don't care if you're a professional or if you're an amateur, it's your first time, the best investment for anybody who wants to smoke meat, or any cooking for that matter, is a digital thermometer, so that you're not guessing about what's going on inside the meat. You actually know for sure. Like, if your brisket's 200 degrees, it's going to be tender, and you don't have to poke and prod, do the little thumb testy thing that you do with steaks to see if it's done.
Last question here. What's something you've never smoked before, but you would love to try?
Actually, I guess mine might be one of the meats that I've never really worked with much myself is mutton, actually, which I've always wanted to kind of try and kind of delve into a bit more. So mutton is basically an old sheep that's kind of gotten a bit tougher and kind of rough around the edges kind of thing. So in some views, it's kind of looked at as a little bit less desirable, but the barbecue places that do it make it as delicious as any other cut of meat. Super smoky, and you can make it fall apart and everything like that. It's got a lot of fat on it and stuff to kind of break down and moisten the meats. But yeah, I've never really worked with it myself. I've never smoked it here before, but I've always been interested in trying out kind of that style of barbecue and trying to play around with that for myself.
Yeah, I'd say like my style of cooking tends to be more like classic and traditional, whereas I think Mark's probably like more on the creative side. So I really like the idea of, I think the mutton kind of like is a good convergence of that, because although it's you don't really see it anywhere except for maybe a few places, like I said, in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a cool, like, you can go down a bit of a barbecue rabbit hole with like the history of like why they are famous for smoking mutton and where it all came from. So I'll go with that. I think we should try that out sometime.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to see like if people would take to it here, because it can be a pretty distinctive flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should do that sometime. I don't even know if there's like mutton
Where do you get
places
mutton?
around. Like nobody wants mutton, so nobody sells it.
It's a joke.
That's the way we think. Nobody wants it, so we're gonna sell it.
Yeah. Business.
Yeah. Business 101.
All right. Well, I think that's all I got here, guys. So,
Cool.
yeah, thanks for doing this. And
Yeah.
cheers.
Thanks for all your questions too.
Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
everybody.